So we didn't agree in which order we're going to do it. Les, you're first on the list. Were you prepared to go first?
That's fine, thanks.
Good. Over to you, Les.
Okay, thank you. I think this mic here is picking me up. Is that okay with everyone? Can you hear all right? I've got a bit of a cold coming on, so voice is not as strong as it normally is. I'm talking about the Racial Discrimination Act and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's experience with racial discrimination. I'm going to give a fairly stark and heavy-hitting commentary, so it basically is inviting you to come back at me and ask some questions or make comments on it. But let me get through this as quickly as I can and see how we go. I want to start off by saying we're addressing what has been stark racial discrimination entrenched in Australia for over 223 years, beginning from 1788. For the first half of this period was the theft of land and resources achieved through genocide and general disregard for humanity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. For the next 75 years after that, which is basically from 1897 when Federation ideas started until 1972 when the Whitlam government came in, it involved policy of which were apartheid, that is segregating the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community away from the rest of Australian society, and a process of heavy assimilation into society. And for the last 40 years, up until 2011, has involved what we can call failed efforts to end racial discrimination and try to achieve equality. So clearly from that quick run through history, racism is deeply entrenched in the political foundations of the nation. The land, for example, belongs to the Crown, and despite the Mabo decision, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are still making protracted claims to try and get land handed back. The mineral and natural resources are taken by the Crown, despite the previous ownership by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and now we're expected to share with all Australians the ownership of those minerals, where Australians generally have given up nothing, they have gained, and where we have lost. Our culture and heritage is unprotected. So we have no provision for our laws, for our language, for protection of our sites in particular. The political domination over us as peoples is guaranteed in the Constitution, through federation, and in the democratic institutions which serve Australians generally well are in fact not democratic institutions for our people. Adjudication of our problems, of our claims, of our complaints is heavily biased. In many cases, adjudication of our issues are done by government bureaucracy, largely determining what the policies are and resolving the conflicts, disputes and claims that we make. And the courts implement biased laws and legal procedures. The rights of our peoples are just now being exposed. It was only in 2007, 4 years ago, that the UN adopted the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is a completely radical view, different from Australia's view of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Indigenous peoples are now universally acknowledged as peoples with the right to self-determination, right to territories and resources, rights to development, rights to political autonomy and self-government. And the UN Charter itself recognises that non-self-governing territories, and peoples of non-self-governing territories, that any nations that are governing these areas must accept as a sacred trust, that's their words in the Charter, the obligation to promote the well-being of the inhabitants of these territories. Australia has supported the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples as of 2009, but holds no accountability to the Declaration and is now considering ratification of ILO Convention 169, which is a treaty which deals with Indigenous and tribal peoples through the ILO organisation. The Racial Discrimination Act has served Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people well from the time it came in 1975. I personally was involved in travelling around Queensland to tell our populations about the Act and what it meant to their rights. And it has done a job in eliminating overt discrimination from everyday lives and society. I've had to deal with people being forced to sit down in front of picture theatres, not allowed into bars, hospitals that had separate sheets for Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people. Of course, we had the Black Act still in place in Queensland, which was a reserve segregation system, and so on. So the Racial Discrimination Act has adequately dealt with that. However, there are still a lot of shortcomings, and I'll just quickly mention these. First off, we know that Australia has not ratified the convention, the International Convention, which deals with racial vilification. So racial vilification is still not outlawed in Australia or criminalised, and we know that racial vilification is very harmful towards Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. There are many instances where the Racial Discrimination Act remains suspended in Australia, for example, for the purpose of the Native Title Act. And many of you may not realise that in fact the Racial Discrimination Act is suspended in relation to certain provisions. The Racial Discrimination Act does not have enough effect to protect sacred sites and interests in Hindmarsh Island. The cultural heritage protection laws in Australia are discriminatory and fail to protect. For the last 10 years, we don't know that there's been any Aboriginal site that's been protected under national or state heritage protection laws from development. The nature of special measures under the International Convention on the Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination is not understood and respected in Australia. In fact, Australia has its own version of what special measures are, and they do not understand what concrete measures under that convention is supposed to be about. When you look at areas like Aboriginal unemployment, despite the statistics that says there was 16% unemployed, Aboriginal unemployment remains at 55%. But employment statistics are not made available to hold the government or employers accountable. In fact, the number of Aboriginal people in the private sector has declined in the last 20 years. The National Reconciliation Campaign, which ran from 1991 to 2001, failed to achieve a reconciled outcome for Australia. The National Social Justice Package, which was promised as part of the Mabo response, promised in 1972-73, was not pursued by the government and therefore has not been put in place. And the Northern Territory Intervention, as we know, is founded upon fabrications and racial discriminations, with the governments themselves officially creating stereotypes and stigmatising the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population. The national government has no commitment to eliminate racial discrimination. The government has not implemented the action plans of the first decade of the world's Indigenous peoples. The government has not implemented the action plans of the second decade of the world's Indigenous peoples. The government has refused to support the program of action of the Durban Declaration or of the Durban Review Conference. The Constitutional Review may or may not resolve some shortcomings in the Racial Discrimination Act. I'll stop here, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Les. Any comments or questions for Les on that? Yes.
Does it bend your head that the government appears to support getting rid of racial discrimination and then does things like forbidding language to be taught in schools?
Absolutely, and I think that, you know,
You heard that up the back? The question was, does it bend your head? I remember the opening lines. Does it? And looked at the government's position on teaching language in schools, banning from teaching language in schools, for example.
Yes, of course it does, and I'll go back to say that I think there's been some wonderful things achieved since the Racial Discrimination Act came in 1975. But for good things that are being achieved, there are also negative things. And I think that the problem we have here, and that's a very, very good example of what the point I'm trying to make, is that there's a lack of accountability in this. Is that on one hand, the government is trying to, let's say, close the gap, is trying to achieve things, it wants to do things positive. On the other hand, it's not creating an accountable climate for how racial discrimination is operating in this country. And I was just talking with a colleague involved in the legal service. We don't have capacity through our legal services to take on cases of racial discrimination. It's just not in the ambit of the cases that they're meant to take on. Everything we're trying to do with all the policies, whether it's close the gap or any other policies the government's trying to implement, racism is not addressed in that. For many years now, we've gone without a full-time racial discrimination commissioner in the Australian Human Rights Commission. Hopefully that's going to change very soon. But it's two different sides of government that we're trying to deal with. And personally, my belief, because I've been working on this side all of my life, is that you have to address racial discrimination at the same time as you're trying to provide special measures and concrete measures for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to achieve their goals. You can't ignore the fact that racism